Imagine this. The world's eyes fixed on a single man. A man draped not just in royal robes, but in the weight of centuries. King Charles. The very symbol of Western monarchy. A crown representing the legacy of empires, the pride of nations, and the unbroken chain of power stretching back 1,000 years. He stands before the cameras, calm, deliberate. Yet what he is about to say will echo far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. Not about politics. Not about the economy. But about something far deeper, faith. He begins to speak. And the air itself seems to pause. "I have seen," he says slowly, "that Islam is not fading. It is not disappearing into history. It is rising." A silence follows. Not the silence of indifference, but the kind that comes when truth lands heavier than anyone expected. For centuries, the West has looked upon Islam through a veil of misunderstanding. A mixture of fear, respect, and curiosity. Yet here was the King of England himself, acknowledging what few dared to say aloud, that Islam's light has not dimmed. It burns brighter with every passing year. But how did we get here? How did a monarch of the West, heir to empires that once colonized Muslim lands, come to admire the very faith they once tried to suppress? The answer lies in history. A long, complex, undeniable truth. From the deserts of Arabia rose a message. Simple, pure, unshakable. That there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That message spread not by swords, but by conviction, character, and truth. It built civilizations when Europe was still lost in its dark ages. It gave the world algebra, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, and a way of life where justice and humility stood side by side. King Charles had studied history long enough to know this. Even as a prince, he spoke about Islamic art, architecture, and spirituality. He called it a civilization of balance. And perhaps now, as king, he sees what many others still deny. That Islam endures where others have fallen. Empires rise and crumble. The Romans ruled, then vanished. The Persians built power, then disappeared. Even the mighty British Empire shrank to history's pages. But Islam? Islam remains. It has survived crusades, invasions, colonization, and modern propaganda. It has been attacked, misrepresented, and opposed, yet it stands, not because of politics, but because of truth. Perhaps that is what King Charles saw. Perhaps, beneath the noise of the modern world, he recognized a pattern, that while nations change, Islam continues to grow, quietly, steadily, like roots spreading deep beneath the surface. And maybe that is why he spoke. Because sometimes, even a king can see what history itself is whispering. That Islam is not the past. It is the future. History remembers conquerors. It remembers armies, kings, and empires that rose with fire and steel. But it often forgets the one thing that outlived them all, faith. And among all faiths, none has been tested as fiercely, attacked as relentlessly, or revived as miraculously as Islam. When the Crusaders marched upon the Muslim world, their banners soaked in blood and their swords gleaming beneath the sun, they believed they could crush a civilization, erase a belief, silence a word whispered across deserts and mountains, La ilaha illallah. But they failed. Because for every city they burned, for every scholar they killed, 100 more hearts carried that same truth forward. You can burn books, but not conviction. You can kill men, but not belief. And then came the Mongols. Ruthless, unstoppable, the destroyers of worlds. They tore through lands like a storm from the east, burning libraries, slaughtering nations, turning Baghdad, the jewel of Islam, into ashes. People said it was the end. They said Islam had been broken. But what happened next stunned history itself. Those same Mongols, who destroyed the Muslim world, eventually bowed their heads in prayer. They accepted the very faith they tried to erase. The conquerors became the conquered, not by sword, but by truth. And the story didn't end there. Centuries later, as the colonial powers rose, Britain, France, Spain, the Dutch, they reached deep into Muslim lands, taking resources, rewriting laws, and trying to shape faith into silence. But Islam does not live in governments. It lives in hearts. And no empire, no matter how vast, can colonize a soul. The colonizers built schools to change minds. But their children ended up studying the Quran out of curiosity. They banned the call to prayer in cities, but they could not stop it from echoing in homes. And when the empires finally collapsed, the faith they tried to bury had spread even further. This is the paradox of Islam. The more it is fought, the stronger it becomes. Like a flame pressed under darkness, it grows until it burns through every shadow. And maybe that's what King Charles saw. Maybe, after years of studying history and witnessing the cycles of rise and fall, he realized something profound. That Islam is not simply a religion of rituals. It's a rhythm of life. A force that rebuilds itself through every storm. From the ashes of Baghdad to the streets of London. From the deserts of Arabia to the skylines of New York. Its call continues. Steady, eternal, unbroken. Empires come and go. Flags change. Borders move. But when the dust settles, one truth always remains. La ilaha illallah. For centuries, the world was told that faith was fading. That the modern age would bury religion under science and progress. But something unexpected happened. As technology advanced, as cities filled with light and noise, a strange emptiness began to spread. People had everything. Comfort, luxury, knowledge. Yet something within them was missing. A quiet hunger grew in their hearts. A hunger for meaning. And in that silence, many began to hear a call. Not from the past, but from the very truth their souls had been searching for. A call that said, "There is no God but Allah." In London, in Paris, in New York, men and women began to open the Quran. Sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of despair, and sometimes because nothing else made sense anymore. And what they found there shook them to their core. They read of mercy, of justice, of a creator who is closer than their own heartbeat. They found answers to questions that money, fame, or philosophy could never solve. And so, quietly, without fanfare or media, people began to embrace Islam. A scientist from Cambridge, who once mocked religion, now bows 5 times a day in peace. A woman from France, who grew up fearing Islam, now wears her hijab with pride. A soldier from America, who fought in Muslim lands, returned home not with hate, but with faith. It is happening everywhere. In classrooms, offices, hospitals, prisons. People are not converting because of force or fame. They are returning to something that feels like home. And the numbers speak for themselves. In Europe alone, Islam is now the fastest growing faith. Mosques are filled not only with immigrants, but with locals whose ancestors once opposed the very thing they now love. Each Friday you see them. Young, old, black, white, Asian, Arab, English. Standing shoulder to shoulder. Equal before their Creator. And perhaps this is what King Charles meant when he said that Islam is not fading away. Because even he, standing atop one of the most secular societies in the world, can see the tide turning. The West once sent its armies to the East. Now its hearts are turning there instead. It's not the rise of a people. It's the rise of peace. Not the conquest of land, but of hearts. And as minarets rise beside cathedrals, as Quranic verses echo beside the Thames, one truth becomes clear. Islam is not foreign anymore. It is part of the world's heartbeat. The same light that once illuminated the sands of Arabia now shines through the glass towers of London. And just as it did before, it calls softly, patiently, inviting all who listen to come home. Long before he wore the crown, before the world called him, "Your Majesty," Charles was not just a prince of Britain. He was a seeker of truth, while others of his rank were lost in luxury and protocol. He was reading books. Books on philosophy, history, and the world's great religions. And among them, one faith stood out: Islam. He studied its art, its architecture, its poetry, its law, its devotion to order and harmony. He once said, "The Islamic world is not separate from ours. It is part of our past and our future." These were not empty words. They came from decades of observation, reflection, and quiet admiration. When he visited mosques and Islamic centers, he did not walk through them as a ruler inspecting subjects. He listened. He watched. He asked questions about the call to prayer, about the meaning of submission, about the unity of God that Islam holds above all else. And with every visit, the respect in his heart grew stronger. In one of his most powerful speeches, delivered at Oxford University, he warned the West against arrogance, against dismissing Islam as something foreign or inferior. He spoke of the balance that Islam brings between faith and reason, between man and nature, between body and soul. And he said something that made headlines: "The Islamic world has preserved knowledge and wisdom that Europe once lost, and we have much to learn from it again." Imagine that. A British royal, heir to centuries of empire, standing before scholars and declaring that the West must learn from Islam. That moment was not just bold. It was historic, because Charles had seen what many refused to see: that Islam was not a threat to civilization, but one of its foundations. He saw how Muslim scientists once led the world in medicine, how Muslim architects built cities that still leave people in awe, how Muslim scholars preserved Greek philosophy and transmitted it back to Europe during its darkest ages. He saw that when the world lost its balance, Islam still stood as a model of discipline, dignity, and faith. And perhaps that is why, when he finally became king, his words about Islam carried a quiet authority. They were not political. They were personal. They came from years of seeking, reading, and understanding. When he spoke about the Prophet Muhammad, with reverence and respect, people listened, because they knew he meant it. It was as if history itself had turned a page. The very empire that once colonized Muslim lands was now ruled by a man who admired their faith. It did not mean conversion. It meant recognition. Recognition of truth, of wisdom, of beauty. And maybe that's what the world needs now. Not more walls, but more windows. Windows that let the light of understanding pass through. Because when a king looks toward Islam and finds peace instead of fear, perhaps the world can too. The world moves fast. Empires fall, nations rise. Technology changes overnight. And yet, amid all the noise, one thing remains unshaken: faith. Not blind faith. Not the faith of superstition or fear, but the faith that gives purpose to existence. The kind that Islam has guarded for over 1400 years. Every century has its skeptics. Those who claim religion will fade away, that humanity will outgrow God. But time after time, their predictions dissolve like dust. Because man is not just a mind, he is a soul. And no amount of progress can silence the questions that echo in the human heart. Who made me? Why am I here? What happens when I die? Islam answers those questions with clarity so deep that once heard, it cannot be forgotten. It reminds the world that success is not in wealth or fame, but in surrendering to the one who created both. It reminds us that justice is sacred, that mercy is power, and that true peace begins within. That is why, in every age, even in the age of AI and space travel, Islam continues to grow. Because the human heart has not changed. It still seeks truth. It still longs for peace. It still yearns for God. King Charles saw this. He saw a world racing towards material perfection, but spiritually starving. He saw how Islam, despite centuries of attack and misrepresentation, still stands with dignity, unbroken, undefeated. And perhaps, in his own royal way, he wanted to remind the West that without faith, civilization loses its compass. His words were not about conversion. They were about correction. A call to see Islam not as an enemy, but as a mirror, reflecting what humanity has forgotten about itself. And the signs are everywhere. From young people in Europe reciting the Shahada, to celebrities and intellectuals discovering the Quran, to communities rebuilding their lives through prayer and purpose. Islam's light spreads quietly, humbly, inevitably. It does not need an army. It does not need propaganda. It only needs one thing, truth. And truth, once revealed, cannot be buried. Even the attempts to silence it end up amplifying it. Every attack, every headline, every misunderstanding pushes people to learn more, to read more, to think for themselves. And when they do, they find what so many before them have found. Peace. Not just peace of the world, but peace of the soul. So maybe, just maybe, the king was not predicting the future. He was describing the present. A present the world is too afraid to acknowledge. Because whether we look at history, data, or destiny, the truth is undeniable. Islam is not fading. It is rising. Gently, firmly, beautifully. And the question that remains is not whether Islam will rise, but whether the world is ready to rise with it. Because faith is not the past. It is the future. And the future, as the king hinted, belongs to those who believe.